Hi, this is Sophia Ruan Gushée, author of the critically acclaimed book A to Z of D-Toxing, the ultimate guide to reducing our toxic exposures, and host of this Practical Nontoxic Living podcast. Welcome! The Practical Nontoxic Living podcast is sponsored by the Ruan Detox Immersion and the Detox Academy. The Ruan Detox Immersion is a structured program during which we'll customize a roadmap to detox 4 main pillars of your life: your home, diet, self-care, and technology. Together, we'll craft a plan to detox the risky chemicals, heavy metals, and electromagnetic fields that you won't miss. The Ruan Detox Immersion is wonderful not only for those of you looking to optimize your family's healthy living and environmental sustainability efforts, but also for those dealing with hormone imbalances, unexplained infertility, pregnancy, children, and compromised immune systems from things like cancer and autoimmune issues. For certain professionals like nutritionists, health coaches, physicians, nurses, and even interior designers, the Ruan Detox Immersion can enhance and distinguish your offerings and services. Learn more about this unique offering at ruanliving.com. It's being offered just once in 2020, starting April 1st. There's limited capacity, so apply now. In today's world, practical non-toxic living is as important as healthy eating, regular exercise, and good sleep. So if you're not ready for a detox deep dive, which is the Ruan Detox Immersion, but would like simple tips to get started, then my online detox academy, found at nontoxicliving.tips, offers 2 essential workshops to lead your way. They are called Home Detox and EMF Detox. They outline tips that are not only high impact and practical, but most won't impact your budget. At the Detox Academy, you can also enjoy monthly live Q&As to ask me anything about practical non-toxic living. The easiest way to learn more about any of this and to stay connected is to register for my newsletter. Just text 66866, enter code PODCAST, then enter your email address. And that's it. Hope to see you online at the Detox Academy. Dr. Esther Sternberg served for 26 years in the National Institutes of Health Intramural Research Program as senior scientist and section chief of neuroendocrine immunology and behavior at the National Institute of Mental Health. She has too many other impressive accomplishments to list here, but currently she holds the inaugural Andrew Weil Chair for Research in Integrative Medicine and is Research Director for the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona at Tucson. I learned of Dr. Sternberg through her must-read book, Healing Spaces: The Science of Place and Wellbeing, which was recognized by the president of the American Institute of Architects as an inspiration for launching its Design and Health initiative. Dr. Sternberg's book, Healing Spaces, definitely inspired me to rethink home as an opportunity to decrease stress and support our immune systems and feel-good hormones. As you listen to our conversation, you'll learn about key design features to consider to transform your home into an environment that can support your health and well-being. My family and I have been under renovation for at least 3 years.
Talk about a stressor.
And I didn't even realize the stress it had on me until it was over, because you just need to get through it. And in the fall, in September, the renovation activity stopped significantly, and I decided I'm going to reclaim my home.
Right.
And what was interesting is I started to notice how much the benefits of claiming my space, and it included a lot of plants. It includes a lot of natural, I really wanted natural stones and natural woods. And then I came across your book somehow, Healing Spaces.
That's great.
The Science of Place and Well-being. And for you to talk about how our senses, what we see, hear, smell, and other things, how it affects our brain, our immune response, our hormones, the electrical signaling. It was very exciting for me to read this book. And I know you, and then I went online and I saw your wonderful TED Talk and some other talks you've done online. And I wrote a blog post talking about, and even sharing videos of how Amazon and Microsoft have incorporated these ideas into their new headquarters. And parts of me were screaming, but what about our homes? Like,
you're right.
What about the opportunity to create your home into a healing space? So every night you reset and you're stronger and more resilient to go back into the world.
Yeah. So I'll start by telling you a story of how I realized, I was writing the book and I was researching how we perceive everything around us, whether it's our home or our workspace or our schools or the outdoors, through all our senses, what we see and what we hear and what we smell and what we touch, what we taste, what we do in a space, all affects our emotions and how we heal. But in my own life, I didn't realize, I was going through a renovation too. And I had moved into a new house and I was renovating the deck, which was totally falling apart. You could put your finger through the wood and the contractor said the only thing you should put on top of this deck is air and, not people. And so I designed the deck. I said how far I wanted it to go out and what it would look like. And the railing should be wrought iron and it should have a spiral staircase to go down. It was one level above the ground. And only when I was finished did I realize I had redesigned my mother's deck. I wasn't consciously aware of it. And even to the extent that I had a beautiful holly bush, old holly bush, and the contractor said, well, you'd be better off with a larger deck. And I said, no, absolutely not. The holly bush has to stay there. So the deck is smaller because of where the holly bush was. My mother had done the same thing, 40 years before, where she didn't want a bigger deck because there was a beautiful old lilac tree. So I think the story illustrates that we're often not consciously aware of how our space, physical space, and the place around us, our homes, affect our emotions, how they tap into memories, deep memories of childhood, for example. So, why does a home speak to you when you see it? When I saw this house, I immediately wanted to buy it because, and this was in Washington, D.C., and I didn't know why it spoke to me. And only after I redesigned the deck did I realize it had elements of my mother's home, of the home where I grew up in. And I think that most people, if you're not an architect, you're not consciously aware of how that physical environment impacts your memories, your emotions, and then ultimately healing, because there is a connection between the brain and the immune system. This was the work that I was doing, I've been doing for now 40 some years, proving that there really is a connection between the brain and the immune system, and that when that connection is intact, you have health. And when you break that connection, you have disease. So in my first book, which was published about 10 years before the Healing Spaces, The Science of Place and Wellbeing, I talk about that piece of the mind-body connection. It's called The Balance Within, the Science Connecting Health and Emotions. And when I started in this field, there was a lot of pushback from the powers that be in the scientific and medical community, who said that no, the brain and the immune system don't talk to each other. That was heresy. And I and a small group of other researchers did the science that proved that there really is a connection between the brain and the immune system. In The Balance Within, my first book, The Science Connecting Health and Emotions, I described the research that was done over the years to really prove how the brain and the immune system talk to each other, which shows how stress can make you sick, how believing can make you well. And that led to the next book, Healing Spaces, The Science of Place and Wellbeing, that really takes those concepts out into the physical world and how all those different elements of the physical world can impact your emotions and in turn your ability to heal. So, just to tell you when you are stressed, so how does stress make you sick? When you're stressed, you release a whole lot of chemicals, nerve chemicals from nerve endings, hormones from the brain and the adrenal glands. And ultimately, those hormones and nerve chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline-like nerve chemicals, they cause what the feelings that you have inside of you when you feel stressed. Your heart beating fast, you're anxious, you're sweating, you want to run to the bathroom. That's all caused by that physiological stress response. And those same chemicals, those same hormones affect the immune system and tamp down the immune system's ability to do its job, to fight infections, to fight cancer, to help wound healing. And people who are chronically stressed will have more severe and more frequent viral infections. If you go out to get a flu shot, if you're a chronically stressed caregiver, for example, of an Alzheimer's patient, then you're less likely to have a good take rate of the vaccine because your immune system can't mount that response. If you have a wound, if you have surgery, there's poor wound healing. Wound healing can take 2 weeks longer in a chronically stressed person than somebody who's not stressed. It speeds chromosomal aging. People who are chronically stressed, their chromosomes can look 10 to 17 years older than your chronological age, which is, a big difference. And the cancer growth, it can speed chronic stress through these hormones and nerve chemicals can speed cancer growth. So just to emphasize, stress does not cause all these conditions. Stress makes them worse or speeds them up through all these nerve chemicals and stress hormones. So to the extent that the environment can also stress you, it can contribute to making you sick. And to the extent that we can control our environment, we can design the environment to optimize health, to reduce stress, to actually enhance the positive. And just what you were saying, that the kinds of things around you, that the natural stone, the plants, natural plants, views of nature are very important in reducing stress and optimizing those positive emotions, which in turn release positive hormones and nerve chemicals in the brain, in the reward pathways of the brain, dopamine, opiates that the endogenous brain creates, these endorphins. So all these feel-good hormones and nerve chemicals are released when you're looking at a beautiful view, or you're in nature, or you're breathing deeply, and that helps to reduce your stress response. So and we can talk about the elements of the physical environment that help get you into that relaxed state to help reduce your stress.
That would be great. I would love to also just pause and talk about that even images of nature can be healing. That was interesting and surprising, and it's exciting because not everyone can get a view of nature, but
absolutely
view.
Right, absolutely. So of course, it's better to be in nature because you have all of your senses. You can be inhaling the wonderful fragrance of the blossoms or the trees or the wet grass after a rain, or here in Tucson, after we smell the creosote bushes after a rain, which is a very sweet smell. So being in nature is the best, but if you can't be in nature, yes, absolutely, views of nature can certainly turn on those positive responses in the brain. And I did a PBS television special called The Science of Healing, which what we did is we visited a lot of different labs around the country that are researching these different questions. And it was based on my own story of going through a period of stress, getting arthritis, and then healing, which I'll tell you in a minute. But in the process of doing this television show, I was the guinea pig, and I had my brain scanned in an MRI. And while I was looking at either beautiful images of nature or ugly smokestacks or, junkyards and so on, Irving Biederman at the University of Southern California does this work. And what he's found is that when you look at a beautiful view, and this is across cultures, across ages, gender, socioeconomic status, whatever. People who look at a beautiful view have a positive reaction, and the preferred views are views of nature. And there is a part of the brain that specializes in beautiful views. And it's called the parahippocampal cortex. It has a big, long name, but it's a part of the brain that's sort of underneath your brain. When you look at the view, it goes to your eyes, it goes to the back of your brain, through the optic nerve to the optical cortex, and then it goes back to the front to this part of the brain that is rich in endorphins. And Irving Biederman's theory is that the reason we all want to look at a beautiful view, the reason we all feel better when we look at a beautiful view, is because you're giving yourself a shot of those feel-good endorphins when you look at the view. So we don't know if that's the true theory, the explanation, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
Could you also talk about fractals? I thought that was very interesting, and it might be worth talking about because if you're thinking about interior design, you maybe want to incorporate this idea.
Yeah, that's true. So fractals are repeating geometries at every scale that occur in nature, and they occur in other places, but think of veins on a leaf, leaves on a branch, leaves on a twig, twigs on a branch, branches on a tree. And all those are similar geometries, but at increasing scales. It's the same as snowflakes, the same as trees in a forest. So they're complex geometry patterns that we see over and over again. And again, we don't know why people like to look at these fractals, but people find them calming. So there was a study done by Japanese scientists in the Ryoanji's temple in Kyoto, where there was a beautiful temple garden with rocks arranged in a certain way in the 14th century. And the monks who arranged this garden knew that there was one particular spot where you could stand and look at this rock garden and feel calm. And the scientists, this was probably about 10 years ago, they did a study where they analyzed the geometries using computer algorithms and found that, in fact, the spot where the monks in the 14th century had said is the best place to stand is exactly where the fractal geometries met, where there was harmony. And if they rearranged the rocks in a computer image, they lost that harmony. So again, we don't know why that is, but people like to look at fractals. So, that speaks to, for example, Hokusai's painting of the wave, where there's a big wave with lots of little foaming little curlicues and people in a rowboat and other people in a rowboat. That kind of repeating pattern seems to be calming. So yes, if you can put those kinds of patterns in your home, that can help. You don't want to go overboard because then it's not calming anymore. But again, plants, actual plants. If you can't be in nature, if you could put plants, I see behind you, you have some plants. That will help. There's some studies that show that a minimum of 3 plants to up to 37 plants, that's a lot. It depends how big your space is. Can be calming. That's important too.
This reminds me, in your book you talk about mazes and labyrinths, and
yes.
it was very interesting. And I'd love maybe now to talk about it, because you could maybe visually, when I read your sections in the book about labyrinths and walking meditations, I thought, this is a great idea for carpets, like for a playroom, to have
wow, that's a great idea.
I think it could be really beautiful and playful, with colors.
I don't think anybody has ever said that to me. You can go online and you can find labyrinths near you. They're all over the country. They're all over the world, actually. So what is a labyrinth? It is a pattern on the floor that looks like a circle. It looks like a little bit like a rose. And there's one spot where you enter and you walk around it slowly until you get to the middle. And then you have to walk out again. But it's calming, because really it's a walking meditation. You don't have to think about where you go. On the other hand, a maze is stressful. And why is that? You have to make decisions. In a maze, for example, the best description of a maze is in chapter 4 of Harry Potter's Goblets of Fire. My editor, when I was writing my book, said, you've got to put this in there. You have to put something that young people will relate to and like to read. And I said, I hadn't read Harry Potter. And she said, well, you've got to read this particular book. It is the best description of a maze, which I think might have been taken from the maze outside of Henry VIII's Hampton Court palace outside of London, which was built in the 1500s. And it's a very high hedge, maybe 8-10 feet high, so you can't see over the edge. It's thick, so the sounds are muffled. And as you enter the maze, you have to find your way through it. And you come to decision points and you don't know, should I go right? Should I go left? And then if it's getting dark, you get anxious. And in the Harry Potter case, he was worried that there are monsters lurking behind every turn. And so this is a very stressful thing. You don't have feedback from your different senses as to where to go. So that's a maze, and that's stressful. In fact, mazes have been used in the pharmaceutical industry for maybe 100 years to test the effect of anti-anxiety drugs. Because if an animal in a maze gets anxious, and yet if the drug calms them, then you know that it's working. That's one standard animal test in the pharmaceutical industry. So mazes are stressful. Labyrinths, on the other hand, are calming, because you don't have to think about where you're going. You just walk, and it slows you down because you're following this pattern, and it helps you to breathe deeply and slowly. So it gets you into a quiet rhythm, and that's calming, and it is a walking meditation. So usually, the classic labyrinth that is used across the country, around the world, is based on the labyrinth outside in Chartres Cathedral, just outside of Paris. And it was built by the monks in about the 13th century. And they used it as a walking, prayerful meditation. It's stone laid in the floor of the cathedral, and it's extremely well preserved, because most of the time the pews are placed over the stones, and they only remove the pews so that you can actually walk this labyrinth. I think every once a month or once a week, something like that. So the labyrinths that are usually used in public spaces here can either copy that labyrinth pattern in stone or brick, or if you don't have the ability to do that, so for example, at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., they have the labyrinth printed on a large canvas, and you roll it out. They roll it out every Tuesday night, and they have a choir or harpists, and it's the most wonderful experience at the National. If you're ever in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral, I recommend that you do this one evening, and it's just the most calming, soothing experience. So the military has actually adopted this in their National Intrepid Centers of Excellence hospitals around the country for wounded warriors with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. And the patients and their families and even the staff really get a lot of relaxation and calm out of walking these labyrinths.
Well, I think New York City needs a lot more of these.
Well, and your idea of putting it in the playroom is a great idea. You should patent it and roll them out in the playrooms.
So we talked about what we see and not yet
smell. Yeah. So again, I'll go back to my own story with when I got sick, and I went through a period of extreme stress with my mother dying of breast cancer. This was about 20 some years ago. And I was in Washington, D.C., and she was in Montreal, and I was a long-distance caregiver. And actually, during that period, I developed an inflammatory arthritis, not rheumatoid arthritis, but my joints flared, and I had a lot of pain, and I had trouble walking, and I'd fall, I'd lose my balance. And I had knee biopsies and all kinds of, studies. And I was going to go into hospital to get an experimental drug for arthritis. And then my mother died, and I felt like I can't deal with hospital anymore. I'm just going to leave it alone and do something later. And that's also exactly when I moved into that new house in Washington, D.C. So I had some really major stressors in my life, because moving is a big stressor as well. And I was sitting at the computer on my deck, on that deck that I talked about, beginning to write the beginnings of what was going to be my first book. And my neighbors next door saw me on the deck, and they came over and they rang the doorbell, and they're Greek, and they brought over Greek food to welcome me to the neighborhood, tzatziki and dolmades and all kinds of wonderful Greek food. And they saw me writing, and they said, "Are you a writer?" And I said, "No, I don't know. I do research. I don't think of myself as a writer." And I said, "Why did you ask?" I asked. And they said, "Oh, because we've always wanted a writer to stay at our cottage in Crete." And I said, "I'm a writer." And I went with them to Crete, and only for about 10 days. They had this cottage in a tiny village on the south coast of Crete, the Greek island. The village was called Lentas. And it had maybe 5 or 6 streets, and you couldn't drive in it. You had to leave your car at the edge of the village. And I stayed there and gradually began to exercise more, swim in the Mediterranean every day. I was eating healthy Greek food, Mediterranean diet, rich in olive oil and seafood and fresh vegetables. And I would, when I felt a little more stable, I began to walk to the top of the little hill above the village, where there was the ruins of a Greek temple to the Greek god of healing, Asclepius. And on top of the temple, there were the ruins of a Byzantine church. And atop of that, there was a tiny little Greek chapel with icons and candles. And I would sit there for hours and just look out at the Mediterranean, the beautiful blue Mediterranean, and the white stucco walls and the red fuchsia bougainvillea, and listen to the scratch of the gardener across the way, the sheep and the goats and the ocean. And I didn't realize at the time that that was meditation. That was mindfulness meditation. And I would inhale the wonderful fragrance of the orange blossoms, the jasmine. They had just this wonderful fragrance, and it just was so calming. And again, I didn't realize at that time what it was that made me feel calm. But it was all of those things, what I heard and what I smelled, and the exercise climbing up the hill, and just being in the moment. And again, when I came back home and I sat on my deck, and I said to myself, I can't be in Greece all the time, but I can recreate some of this here. So I, on purpose, put jasmine trees, little jasmine bushes, and fragrant plants, herbs that had the fragrance that reminded me of Greece. And then I thought deeper into my memory. Why is this so calming? Why is the smell of orange blossoms so calming to me? And it reminded me that my mother in her garden had mock orange bushes in Montreal, where I grew up. You don't have citrus trees. In the winter it's too cold. But she had mock orange bushes that the white blossoms smelled very much like citrus trees. And so that, I think, was the deep memory that brought back to me. But there were layers of memory, so that then after I came back from Greece, that fragrance of the jasmine reminded me of the lemon blossoms and orange blossoms in Crete. And now that I live in Tucson, Arizona, I just love the smell of the orange blossoms and all over the city. It's just amazing.
It's interesting. It seems like there's this pattern of what are the triggers of good memories and feel-good hormones, right? And
yes, absolutely.
The triggers can be visual or through smell.
You've got it. Absolutely, absolutely. And that's how memory works. There are subtle triggers which are through any one of your senses. Proust, the French writer of the 19th century, wrote about the Madeleine and the tea that he tasted. And he had this wonderful, when he was sick, he had this wonderful feeling that came over him, this warm feeling. And the first 40 pages of Remembrance of Things Past are describing him eating this Madeleine and tea. So some people find it a little bit long to talk about. But really, it's a perfect description of the neuroscience of how memory works. He had the warm feeling as soon as he tasted the cookie and drank the tea, but he couldn't place why did he have that feeling. And it took him 40 pages to figure out that it was because when he was a sick child, his aunt would give him that kind of cookie, the Madeleine and the tea, and that made him feel warm and taken care of by his aunt. So taste is a very, very powerful trigger of positive memories and positive emotions. I'll tell you another story of that. When my father was dying, it was now about 30 years ago, he had some sort of dementia, Parkinson's disease, and had been sick for a number of years, and had not really recognized me, for the longest time. And when I was called to the emergency room to fly from, again, Washington to Montreal, the doctor said, you have to come now. It's not much longer that he has to live. I happened to have been in the kitchen with my daughter, who at the time was about 10 years old, and we were making kumquat jam because a colleague of mine from California had brought me a bag of kumquats from his kumquat tree. So I think there's a thread here that I like citrus. But so we were making kumquat jam, and I got the call to fly up. So I got on the next plane, And I put a jar of kumquat jam in my handbag, which you could do at that time. And because my father's favorite jam used to be kumquat jam. So I got to his bedside. He was unconscious, and I whispered in his ear. I said, I'm here, and no response. I touched him. I touched his forehead, no response. And then I had the idea. I took a spoon and I took a little bit of that kumquat jam and I put it on his tongue. And he had the most wonderful smile. And that was his goodbye to me.
Wow.
And so, taste, smell, bring back memories, happy memories, positive feelings. So you can put, again, I'm allergic to a lot of stuff, so I can't put fake fragrances in my house, but real fragrances like those plants that have a fragrance, for me, that's very important. You can, when you're going to sleep at night, if you have trouble sleeping, you can use a little bit of lavender spray, or that's the whole basis of aromatherapy. So that's, the fragrance is what you smell, what you taste, and a lot of taste is also smell. What we talked about, what we see, but we didn't talk about light. Full spectrum sunlight is really, really important. So I'm sitting here in my home office, and you can't see what I'm looking at. I'm looking at a window. My computer is facing a window in a beautiful desert garden. And that's really important. If you're in any space that where you're working, where you're studying, full spectrum sunlight is very important. And that's because it improves moods. People who have a form of depression called seasonal affective disorder, which they get depressed during periods of long periods of low light in northern climates. They come down to the south. So we have a lot of snowbirds who come to Tucson in the winter, and it's rejuvenating. And the reason is full spectrum sunlight really does improve moods. It is as effective in treating this form of depression, seasonal affective disorder, as any drug. And if you don't have the advantage of sitting next to a window that is sunny, then you can put full spectrum sunlight boxes. There's artificial light that mimics the sunlight, and you can put those around.
I've been wondering if there were artificial.
Yes.
Okay, great.
They're used in treatment of seasonal affective disorder, and you can certainly place them around your computer. There are studies that our colleagues at the General Services Administration have done with the federal government, and colleagues at the RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, who are experts in lighting. And you can certainly put those around the computer if you're spending a lot of time, looking at this blue screen. Now, you have to be careful, because if you have them on all day, then you're going to be really awake and zinged. Full spectrum sunlight in the afternoon is probably as good a wake up as a cup of coffee. So you have to be careful that as the day wanes, you don't want to have too much exposure to the sunlight. You want to mimic what is the natural light, and the natural circadian rhythm is what we call it. So there's smell, taste, light. What did we leave out?
A question about light. If you are sleepy in the afternoon and you want to maybe try and avoid the coffee for the caffeine pickup, how much time in the full spectrum light will give the effect of waking you up?
Oh, that's a really good question. One of the things that's a good thing to do is not only look at full spectrum sunlight, but if you're sleepy, go out and walk in it. And that's the best thing, because both exercise and light will wake you up. And in that case, it's recommended 30 minutes of exercise a day, walking, and it can be in small segments, like 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, will certainly give you more energy. I don't know if there's a minimum, amount. It wouldn't be a cup.
It might depend on where you live too.
Well, there are studies, again, by Mariana Figueroa at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where she has looked at this. And for example, blue light in waking people up in the middle of the night, even just a short flash of it, will actually wake up your brain when you should be trying to sleep. So it doesn't take very long for the light to stimulate you.
And another question, how strong is the science on aromatherapy?
Well, there's a lot of science. This is what I talked about in the book, and I just talked about now on the neuroscience. So sensory neuroscience is a very strong, very well researched field. And to the extent that one can take the principles that are learned from sensory neuroscience, that is understanding the neural pathways of smell, how they tap into memory, how those memories tap into emotions, how the emotions tap into the stress and relaxation response. And that's what I try to do in the book. It's not necessarily a direct study to show how each different aromatherapy modality works, but there is very strong neuroscience underpinning understanding how the sense of smell connects to the rest of the brain that we then know can help you heal and certainly can calm you. So at the Monell Center for the Chemical Senses in Philadelphia, we did this in the PBS show, The Science of Healing. I also went there and again was the guinea pig. And what they do is they look at the combination of the sense of smell and what you see. And those two interact as well. And they put me in my head was in a sort of a plexiglass box. And they said they're going to put in a tiny amount of something I'm going to smell whatever it is they put in. They didn't tell me what it was. And at the same time, I'm looking at either a beautiful view or a smokestack. So when I saw the smokestack, the puff of whatever they put in there to me smelled like burning rubber. And when I saw the beautiful view of the forested mountain, the puff of smell to me smelled fresh. I couldn't tell what it was. And then they told me that it was actually just a puff of air or something. And I must be very, very susceptible to what I see. I have a very strong visual sense. So there are connections in the brain that way. And there are certainly connections in the brain between what you smell and memory. And then there are chemicals, for example, lavender. Lavender actually does cause animals to sleep. There are studies that show that rats, when they are given inhale lavender, they have actually EEG, brainwave changes that show that they're sleeping. And, you can't say, well, the rat remembered that the grandmother gave lavender to him. It's clearly there are brain pathways that this chemical, lavender, can trigger a calming response. There are many examples of different kinds of chemicals, because after all, what are fragrances but chemicals that are in the air? They're volatile organic compounds that you inhale, and they can have direct effects on the brain's relaxation response.
Great. And music or sound?
Oh, we forgot about sound. How could we forget about sound?
And silence.
Yes, definitely. So there's a lot of studies, tremendous studies on music and sound and emotions. Books have been written on it. And again, in our PBS television show, The Science of Healing, Julian Thayer, who is a psychophysiologist, world famous in measuring the relaxation response through the heart rate, measuring the heart rate variability, that is the variability between the beats. So Julian Thayer is not only a world famous psychophysiologist, he is also a famous jazz musician. And he got into the field of psychophysiology because he started off as a jazz musician, and he wondered why it was that his compositions could affect people's moods so deeply. And so there's a large science of music and emotions and music and the brain. Some of the people who do this the best, who can use sound and music to change your emotions, either to make you anxious or fearful or calm or happy, those are the composers who compose movie scores. So we've worked with a 7-time Emmy Award-winning film scorer who has, it's part of their trade. They know how to show a film, silent film of whatever, and then overlay different kinds of musical scores, and it will change your emotions. And there are studies that show that you can measure heart rate variability, that is, measure the stress and relaxation response in people who are listening to different kinds of music. And you can see the changes in their stress response in relation to the music. I mean, when I don't like scary movies, and you know, if I see on TV, I'm flipping through channels and I see something that to me looks scary, I'll turn the sound off. And then it calms me because, okay, well, I'm not going to watch it anyway. But it reduces that emotion because you take away that sound. We, you know, sounds.
What is it about music that can be so powerful? Is it the patterns and the?
It's people have done these studies. It's all of the above. It's the timbre, it's the pitch, it's the patterns, and you know, I'm not a music expert, but there are studies that have, you know, shown this and analyze it. But really, again, it's combinations of all of the above that are most effective, not single notes or single changes.
Have you looked at the science on chanting Sanskrit?
Oh, okay. Now that's a different thing. So in the book, I actually talk about this. So one thing is listening to music, and the other thing is singing it. And so they're two different things, and people have studied this. So when you're actually singing, you are breathing deeply. You are doing all kinds of physical things that can help relax you. However, there are studies that looked at professional musicians, professional singers, versus just the rest of us. And while singing and group singing and chanting can certainly reduce your stress response if you're not a professional, professionals, it tends to increase their stress response because they are actually performing. So, but in general, what singing does, chanting, all of these things, it helps you breathe deeply, and breathing deeply triggers your relaxation response. So I talked about the brain's stress response and all those adrenaline-like nerve chemicals and hormones and cortisol that comes from the adrenal glands. Well, there is an opposite system in the body called the relaxation response, and the vagus nerve is a very important piece of the relaxation response. It's a big nerve that goes through your whole abdomen to your liver and your heart, and and your chest, of course, for the heart, and it controls the speed of the beating of the heart. When you trigger the vagus nerve, the heart rate slows down. You know, athletes have a slower heart rate, but stronger pumping. When you're anxious, adrenaline speeds the heart, and it's also pumps more shallowly, so it's not as effective in feeding your whole body with that oxygen that comes from the blood. So the relaxation response is like the brake to the stress response. And deep breathing triggers that relaxation response. You inhale and you exhale slowly, and that triggers that vagus nerve and the relaxation response. So that is happening when you're chanting or singing, when you're exercising, when you're swimming. It's happening when you're walking a labyrinth. Slow walking meditation, slowing your breathing. That's the relaxation response that triggers, that kicks in. So to the extent that you can fill your home with the kinds of things that will trigger your relaxation response, that can also help you stay happy, healthy, and heal.
And what about silence?
Silence. Well, I particularly love silence. I think silence, especially silence in nature, is not completely silence. It allows you, so again, this is really mindfulness meditation. If you quiet yourself, if you quiet your mind and you sit and you listen to the silence, you can begin to hear the tiny, tiny little sounds that you might not have heard before. The rustling of trees, rustling of leaves in the wind, little scratch of little animals, birds chirping. And when it snows in Montreal, or even when I was in Washington, D.C., when it snows, the silence is a much deeper silence because the snow muffles everything, but there's still some sounds. You're walking on the snow and you hear the crunch underneath your feet. So silence is a beautiful thing and can help calm your mind and calm your moods.
And the science on meditation and how it affects our health is pretty strong now, correct?
It's extremely strong. So Richie Davidson was one of the pioneers in this area. And again, when we were all part of a MacArthur Foundation mind-body network back in the 90s, and we came about 15 researchers from across the country, and Richie Davidson was one. And in our own institutions, we had a lot of pushback from the academic scientists and medical community that said, "Oh, meditation, that's not real. I mean, that's not, there's no science to it." But Richie really did the landmark studies where he looked at brain EEG changes, so brainwave changes, MRI changes, so brain imaging changes, looking at changes in blood flow in different parts of the brain. And he was able to show that during a meditative state, there are very important changes in the brain that are not completely, it's not that the brain goes to sleep, that nothing is happening. They really are active changes in parts of the brain that are important in resilience. So when he first started doing these studies back in the 90s, he was studying students who were learning how to meditate, and the data was all over the map. He couldn't make sense of it, and right at that time he got a fax. He tells the story that he got a fax from the Dalai Lama saying that he's interested in understanding the science of meditation. So Richie Davidson started working with the Dalai Lama and his monks, who are really the Olympic athletes of meditation. They can really meditate. They're experts. And he found in those in those expert meditators that there were these very consistent changes in brain patterns, including something that's really interesting because they're a different kind of electrical wave called gamma waves that suddenly come across the whole brain and kind of connect the whole brain when the monks achieve this state of meditation, of the ultimate state of meditation, of compassionate meditation. And so again, we don't fully understand what those mean, but there are definite changes in meditation, in the brain during meditation. And these are changes that also trigger that relaxation response and reduce the stress response. when I was moderating a panel at one of Richie Davidson's mind-body conferences. I was moderating a panel with the Dalai Lama, and the panel was about whether meditation can be used to reduce stress and help heal. And I asked the Dalai Lama if, I said, I understand that meditation, that stress is not a word in the Tibetan tradition, but here in the West, we use meditation to reduce stress. And what do you think about that? And he shook his head and he didn't want to answer. And then finally he said, no, meditation, stress is not a term in the Tibetan tradition, but we use meditation for love. That's it. It's as simple as that, to increase love. But from a neuroscience point of view, increasing the positive, increasing those positive love pathways, dopamine, endorphins, those positive emotions, is not only as good as reducing stress, but it's better than reducing stress, because those brain changes do reduce stress and they also enhance the positive. So there's tremendous research and tremendous literature showing the benefits of meditation, different kinds of meditation, mindfulness meditation, compassion meditation, and so on.
Is it compassion meditation that is proven to be the most healing?
They're talking about meditation. Again, this is Richie Davidson's quote. Saying the word meditation is like saying the word sports. It's like there's so many different kinds of meditation that get you to a place of calm and healing. It's kind of like saying basketball is, and volleyball and golf are all the same. They're not the same. But meditation is also like prayer. So there are studies also in nuns who visualize, who visualize during prayer. There are studies of people repeating the rosary, and so that's kind of auditory or vocal repetitions, and all of those things activate the same parts of the brain. You just get there in different ways. And what helps one person may not help another. That some people may prefer or may have a response by doing the rosary, some by visualizing, some by deep breathing, some by saying there are just many ways to get to that place. And it really depends on the individual. So it's not one size fits all, and individuals can try out different approaches. For me, again, going back to Greece, and if you watch the PBS show, which I think you can get on pbs.org, I say in the show that I'm contemplating. I wasn't ready back then. That was about 2009, 10 years ago. I wasn't ready to say I'm meditating. I didn't know I was meditating until I met a 40-year meditator, and he asked me, what do you exactly do when you're contemplating? And I said, well, I close my eyes and I sit quietly and I listen to the birds, and I listen to the sounds of the wind in the leaves. And he said, you're meditating. That's mindfulness meditating. And I didn't even know it. So anybody can do it anywhere. And you just try what the method that works for you.
I thought it was very interesting when I was watching some of your videos, you talking about when you, early in your career, when you started studying stress and whether it could contribute to health issues or autoimmune issues. That was like a very novel, provocative idea. And now there's such strong science proving that stress is very important to health and well-being. Mm-hmm. So you've experienced how slow science can be to prove a truth. And so I thought you would be an interesting person to ask, generally, because I feel like the more I learn, the more humbled I become about how little we know. And there's something really wise about knowing that we don't know, we know a small percentage of even just how the human body works. Do you agree? Do you have comments
Yeah,
on
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think an example of that is in the book I write about Lourdes and the south in the southwest of France, where people go for miracle cures. And I went there with a dear friend of my parents, who, after my parents died, I kind of became their adopted American daughter. They live in Lyon, France, and unfortunately the husband has since died, but he was a confirmed atheist, and his wife was a devout Catholic. And she grew up near Lourdes, and she would go there every summer with her family. And in her adulthood, she continued to go to Lourdes. And when I was writing the book, Healing Spaces, my friend said, well, you can't write about healing spaces without going to Lourdes. And I said, well, it's hard to get there. And they said, no, fly to Lyon and we'll drive across the southwest of France and we'll take you to Lourdes. So we did that. And they were friends with the Archbishop of the next diocese, the Archbishop of Auch. So he introduced me to the doctor, the chief doctor of Lourdes. And people come there. It's a shrine to the Virgin Mary, where Bernadette Soubirous, who was a peasant girl back in the late 1800s, had seen visions of the Virgin Mary, and then healings had taken place. And so from the late 1800s on, pilgrims, millions of pilgrims have gone there for healing. And so I asked the doctor, what is it about this place that helps people heal? And he said, well, of course, it's the mountains, it's the sunlight, it's the river, it's the beauty of the place, the rocks. And it is beautiful. The sunlight comes through the mountains there. It's sort of filtered in this beautiful mist. And everything takes place outdoors, or at least most of the grotto where Bernadette Soubirous saw the visions of the Virgin Mary is outdoors, and the processions are outdoors. So you're in nature, but you're also in the middle of this bustling town that sells a lot of a lot of souvenirs related to the grotto and to the Virgin Mary. And there's the water from the source, which is the healing water. But what the doctor said is, it's not just the physical place. It's about the people here. People come to help other people. There's love in the air. It is the most amazing thing. There's strangers helping strangers, people showing love, genuine love to the sick. So there's that really helps. So there's the social connections that help people heal. And then above it all, there's the history and the legend, which is very powerful in helping people heal. So why am I telling this story? You said there's a lot that we don't know. Bernard, my friend, who's a physician, and he was, he believed in only things that we could prove. He got so interested in the miracle cures at Lourdes that he spent 5 years researching the cures. He talked to the doctor, the chief doctor, the previous chief doctor. He ended up writing a manuscript, which we wrote together, and published a paper in his journal of history of medicine, and trying to explain what is the science that explains these cures. And there is a science. You could imagine if somebody is extremely stressed, and then they come into this wonderful environment where there's a lot of helping hands that reduces your stress response, that could allow your body to heal. So certainly in tuberculosis and arthritis, which were a lot of the cures in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But he ended the article, and these were his own words, there are many things that we cannot explain in science, and we just have to leave it at that and accept that we cannot understand everything. So especially coming from that physician who was so convinced of the need for concrete proof to say there are things that we cannot understand, to me and to the editor of the journal, it was very, very powerful.
Yes. 3 more questions. One is earlier we were talking about chronic stress and the health effects from that. Are there easy ways to know if you're experiencing chronic stress? When I was listening to you, I thought about many children in Manhattan and just children in general. Anxiety is higher than ever. Are there blood tests to know if your inflammation is elevated?
Well, there's certainly blood tests to know that your inflammation is elevated. There are, you can measure cortisol, but cortisol reflects your stress in the moment. And the needle stick, it could be simply the cortisol going up. Plus, you need your cortisol. You need that stress response in order to have the energy, to have focused attention, to fight or flee. You need that stress response. You cannot survive without a stress response. In Manhattan, if you were to have no stress response and you had to cross the street, you'd be dead, right? You have to be able to be vigilant, look where the cars are coming. You have to be able to concentrate, to get across the street fast. You have to have the energy to do that. That's your stress response working for you. The problem happens if it goes on too long, and that's where you have the problem. And, so there's situations like burnout. Burnout is a serious problem, and you can feel depressed, lethargic, not have energy, have difficulty sleeping, you lose your appetite, you're, losing weight. If you feel anxious, all of those things are signs that you might be chronically stressed or even depressed. And it would be a reason to see a doctor to check you out. So I think if anybody feels that they're chronically stressed, that it's a good thing to see a health professional and get checked out.
Okay. Second, I've been very, very interested in resiliency and or healing. And I'm wondering, what comments do you have to share about the opportunity for our resiliency? I know that we are healing all the time. And when we sleep, especially if we have good quality sleep, the healing is even more powerful. But there might be a lot of people out there who think, oh, it's too late for me for X, Y, and Z reasons. What are your reactions to the opportunities we have to heal?
It's never too late. So I guess I was an example of that. I had been following a sedentary lifestyle. I told you exercise every day, 30 minutes of exercise a day is really important. I'd been eating hamburgers and French fries and for lunch. I was, sedentary, had an unhealthy diet. I was stressed because of this number of stressors in my life. And yet, when I had this aha moment in Greece, that if I continued to function the way I was before I left, I would just keep getting sicker. And I felt so much better only after 10 days. Now, people can say, oh, well, you just had a vacation. Well, a vacation is a good thing. Actually, in Germany and Italy, a doctor can prescribe 6 weeks at a spa for burnout. Wow. So, yeah. it's not just a vacation. It is getting away from those stressors, but also engaging in those healthy activities. And that's really important. And there are studies. So, for example, Dean Ornish has shown that people who are chronically stressed, who have, they had a history of prostate cancer, a man with a history of prostate cancer, if they follow this routine of 30 minutes of walking a day, it doesn't have to be on the treadmill, it's just 30 minutes of walking a day, a healthy Mediterranean diet, and mindfulness meditation 3 times a week, if they follow that for 5 years, their chromosomes, which I mentioned, the chromosomes can be 10 to 17 years shorter than your biological age if you're chronically stressed. Not only did their chromosomes stop shortening, but they actually lengthened. As opposed to people in that study who didn't follow that regime and their chromosomes continued to shorten. So it doesn't matter when you start. You can always begin to reverse the process. And it's really a lifestyle change. And that's what I'm here. The reason I left the National Institutes of Health and came to Andrew Weil's Center for Integrative Medicine. I had the research program here at Andrew Weil's Center for Integrative Medicine. The reason I came here is to really begin to understand how all of these different modalities can help us heal. And again, it does not matter when you start. You'll always be able to improve that resilience if you engage in these healthy lifestyle changes.
So my last question is just, is there anything else that you would like to share that we haven't covered?
Well, I can share one of the stories that I tell at the end of my book, which really it's about my own healing place. And it tells the story of how when I was a child, we would sit outside on the terrace on that deck that my mother had built, and I'd sit there and have breakfast with my father. And it was only about a decade after the end of the war, World War II. And he would say, he'd stop, he'd always read a book when he was eating, and he'd stop and he'd say to me, listen to the sounds of peace. And I was about, 6, 7 years old, something like that. And I'd say, what is he talking about? I hear a dog barking. I hear the tennis balls, the pock of the tennis balls in the tennis court across the street. I hear the wind in the trees, and I couldn't understand. It was only when I was an adult that I really understood what he was talking about, because he reveled in listening to these sounds of peace. It's a little like what you said of the silence, sounds of silence. And I didn't know until his funeral, until the Shiva, when we sit after the funeral in the Jewish tradition, I didn't know that he had been in a concentration camp during the war. And one of the friends who came said, of course, you knew that your father was in a concentration camp. I said, I didn't know that. It wasn't in a German concentration camp. It was in Russia, in a place called Transnistria. So it was more like a work camp, but he never talked about it. I think they wanted to really protect, my parents wanted to protect us, my sister and me, from this horrible, their experiences that they had gone through. And at that point, I understood something else about my father. When we would eat dinner, often he would pull the Bible off the shelf and he'd read the 23rd Psalm. It was his favorite psalm. And he would have this look of wisdom and calm when he'd read it. Now let me see if I can remember it. He leads me by the still waters. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I think when my father was in that concentration camp, I can imagine that he didn't have a view of nature. He couldn't go out into nature, but he could visualize this. He could hear it in his mind. He could think that beautiful poem that beautiful song, and that could give him a sense of peace. So if you can't actually physically experience the beautiful views and the plants and the sounds of peace and the fragrances of the forest, you can go to a favorite place in your mind and experience it. So that's the only thing I would leave everyone with.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Podcast show notes can be found at my website at nontoxicliving.tips. To more easily listen to other episodes, please subscribe to the Practical Nontoxic Living podcast. And if you'd like to support it, then please like it and share it. Until next time.